happens when the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy discover they've been wrong about humans for centuries? What occurs when a single moment of cruelty reveals a truth so terrifying that it reshapes the very foundation of interstellar politics? At the Nexus Academy, where the brightest minds from 1,000 worlds gather to learn, a simple human exchange student named Sarah Chen becomes the catalyst for the most shocking revelation in galactic history. They thought they knew what humans were capable of. They thought they understood the species that had barely crawled out of their own solar system. They were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how cornering one human girl didn't just expose the truth about her species. It exposed the lie that every advanced civilization had been living. A lie about strength, about evolution, about what it truly means to survive in a universe that wants you dead. Some secrets are kept to protect others.
You trespass on my domain,
Some secrets are
human.
kept because the
Defy
truth would
me,
shatter
and
worlds.
your world will
And some
burn.
secrets are kept because the alternative is too terrifying to imagine. Welcome to the day the galaxy learned why humans don't just survive. They thrive in ways that would drive other species to madness. Sarah Chen stepped off the transport shuttle onto the crystalline platform of Nexus Academy, her worn Earth-issue backpack slung over one shoulder and a datapad clutched in her free hand. The sight that greeted her defied every expectation she had harbored during the 3-month journey from Sol System. Towering spires of living coral stretched toward the artificial sky, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served as both decoration and communication networks. Students from dozens of species moved along the walkways with graceful efficiency, their forms ranging from the ethereal Ithuriels with their gossamer wings to the massive chronic with their stone-like carapaces. She felt incredibly small and fragile in comparison. The Academy was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built by the combined efforts of the Galactic Educational Consortium. Each species had contributed their greatest architectural achievements to create this floating city that orbited the neutral world of Kepler 442b. The Vorthak had grown the living coral structures that formed the main buildings. The crystalline silicates had contributed the transparent walkways that seemed to float in midair. The insectoid hive minds had created the perfectly efficient transportation networks that moved students and faculty between the various sectors. And now, for the first time in the Academy's 800-year history, they had a human student. Sarah consulted her datapad, trying to match the flowing alien script with the translation her universal communicator provided. Building 7, Section C, Level 15. Her dormitory assignment seemed straightforward enough, but navigating the three-dimensional maze of the Academy was proving more challenging than she had anticipated. The other students moved with an intuitive understanding of the layout that spoke to generations of evolutionary adaptation to complex environments. Their species had developed in cities that grew rather than being built, in societies that thought in 3 dimensions rather than the flat planes that dominated human architecture. A group of ethereal students floated past her, their translucent forms catching the light, filtering through the Academy's bioluminescent ceiling. Their conversation was a series of harmonic tones that her translator rendered as academic discussion about quantum mathematics. They glanced at her with what she interpreted as polite curiosity before continuing on their way. Sarah tried to smile and wave, but the gesture seemed to confuse them more than anything else. This was going to be harder than she thought. The selection process to become the first human exchange student had been grueling. Out of the 8 billion people on Earth, only a few thousand had even met the basic requirements. Fluency in at least 3 alien languages, advanced degrees in multiple scientific disciplines, and psychological profiles that indicated exceptional adaptability. Sarah's background in xenobiology and her thesis on comparative evolution had made her a strong candidate, but it was her scores on the cultural sensitivity test that had ultimately secured her place. Now, standing in the middle of an alien city surrounded by beings that evolution had crafted in ways that human imagination had never quite managed to envision, she wondered if those tests had been adequate preparation for the reality of her situation. The Academy's student body represented 47 different species from across the galaxy, each one a member of a civilization that had achieved interstellar travel and been accepted into the Galactic Educational Consortium. The humans were the newest addition to the consortium, having been granted probationary membership only 5 years earlier after finally developing faster-than-light travel. Most of the other species had achieved this milestone centuries or even millennia ago, and their students carried themselves with the confidence of beings whose ancestors had been exploring the stars since before human civilization had learned to write. Sarah eventually found her way to the dormitory building. though not without taking several wrong turns that led her through a hydroponic garden maintained by the plant-like Verdani, and past a meditation chamber where several Zephyrian students floated in perfect silence, their crystalline bodies refracting light into complex patterns. Each species seemed to have carved out their own spaces within the academy, creating microenvironments that catered to their specific biological and cultural needs. Her room was on the 15th level, accessible through a transport tube that moved with smooth organic efficiency. The door recognized her genetic signature and dilated open to reveal a space that had been carefully designed to accommodate human physiology. The artificial gravity was set to Earth normal. The atmospheric composition matched Terra's sea level standard, and the temperature was maintained at a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure her comfort. The room itself was larger than she had expected, with a sleeping area, a study space equipped with a quantum computer interface, and what appeared to be a small kitchen area. A large transparent wall offered a view of the academy's central courtyard, where students from various species were engaged in what looked like recreational activities. She watched as a group of Kronex students engaged in what appeared to be a form of martial arts, their massive forms moving with surprising grace as they practiced combat techniques that involved shifting their stone-like skin into different defensive configurations. A soft chime from her door announced a visitor. The panel dilated to reveal a tall, elegant figure that Sarah immediately recognized as a sylphid, one of the few species in the academy that bore some superficial resemblance to humans. The being stood nearly 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and features that seemed almost stretched compared to human proportions. Their skin had a subtle silver sheen, and their eyes were large and multifaceted, like cut gems. "Greetings, human Sarah Chen," the sylphid said, their voice carrying the musical quality that characterized their species' communication. "I am Veltar Nixahan, your assigned cultural liaison. I trust your journey from your homeworld was not overly taxing." Sarah's universal translator rendered the formal greeting patterns of the sylphid language into something approximating English, though she could hear the underlying harmonics that carried additional layers of meaning she couldn't fully grasp. "Thank you, Veltar. The journey was long but fascinating. This place is incredible. The Academy represents the pinnacle of cooperative achievement among the civilized species of the galaxy," Veltar replied with obvious pride. "You are fortunate to be the first of your kind to experience its wonders. I have been tasked with ensuring your successful integration into Academy life and culture." There was something in the way Veltar said, "your kind," that made Sarah pause. It wasn't openly hostile, but there was a subtle condescension that suggested the sylphid viewed humans as something less than equal. She had been warned about this during her preparation. Humans were the newest members of the Galactic Educational Consortium, and their technology and society were considered primitive by the standards of the more established civilizations.
"I appreciate your assistance," Sarah said carefully.
"I know my people have a lot to learn from the other species here." Veltar's multifaceted eyes seemed to glitter with something that might have been amusement. "Indeed, your species' recent emergence onto the galactic stage has been notable. The speed with which you developed faster-than-light travel after achieving spaceflight was quite remarkable, though your methods were rather crude compared to the elegant solutions developed by more mature civilizations." Sarah bit back her first response. The human development of FTL travel had been the result of a desperate push to reach the stars before Earth's deteriorating environment made the planet uninhabitable. It hadn't been elegant, but it had been effective, and it had earned them a place among the starfaring races. She had been warned that many of the older civilizations viewed humanity's rapid technological development with suspicion and disdain. "We're here to learn," she said simply. "I'm looking forward to studying alongside students from across the galaxy." "Of course," Veltar replied. "Your academic schedule has been carefully designed to provide you with exposure to the fundamental principles that underlie advanced galactic civilization. You will begin with basic courses in quantum mechanics, molecular biology, and cultural studies. These subjects should provide an adequate foundation for more advanced work, assuming you prove capable of grasping concepts that may be beyond your species' current understanding." The condescension was becoming more obvious now, though Veltar maintained the polite tone that diplomatic protocols required. Sarah found herself wondering how many of the other students and faculty shared similar attitudes about humanity's place in the galactic community. "I've been studying quantum mechanics and molecular biology since I was 15, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level. "My doctoral thesis was on the evolutionary adaptations that allow extremophile organisms to survive in conditions that would kill most other life forms. I think I can handle the coursework." Beltar's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been surprise before the formal diplomatic mask reasserted itself.
Fascinating. I was not aware that your species began advanced studies at such an early developmental stage.
Most civilized races do not begin quantum-level education until their neural structures have fully matured. Humans mature quickly, Sarah replied. We have to. There was a moment of silence, as Veltar seemed to process this information. Finally, the sylphid nodded formally. Your orientation begins tomorrow at the start of the first cycle. I will escort you to ensure you do not become lost in the Academy's layout. The other students are eager to meet the first human to join our academic community. After Veltar departed, Sarah spent some time exploring her room and familiarizing herself with the Academy's computer systems. The quantum interface was far more advanced than anything available on Earth, capable of processing information at speeds that seemed almost magical compared to human technology. She accessed the Academy's library and began reading about her fellow students and the civilizations they represented. What she found was both fascinating and somewhat disturbing. The species that made up the Galactic Educational Consortium had achieved their advanced status through millennia of careful development and refinement. Their civilizations had grown slowly and steadily, building upon solid foundations of knowledge and culture. They had learned to work together, to share resources and information, to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and careful negotiation. War was almost unknown among them, having been largely eliminated through advanced social engineering and biological modification. Humans, by contrast, were seen as violent, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Their rapid technological development was viewed as reckless and unstable. Their history of warfare and conflict was considered evidence of a fundamentally flawed evolutionary path. Many of the academic papers she read suggested that humanity would need extensive guidance and possibly genetic modification before they could be truly integrated into galactic civilization. Sarah found these assessments both insulting and oddly naive. The authors seemed to view human aggression and adaptability as bugs rather than features, failing to understand that these traits had been essential to humanity's survival on a world that had tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways. Earth was a death world by galactic standards, with an unstable climate, active geology, and a biosphere that featured predation, disease, and competition as fundamental organizing principles. Most of the Academy species had evolved on garden worlds, planets with stable climates and gentle evolutionary pressures that had allowed them to develop elaborate societies and technologies without facing the constant threat of extinction. They had grown up in a universe that was fundamentally safe and predictable, where cooperation was always more advantageous than competition, and where violence was an aberration rather than a survival tool. Sarah wondered what they would think if they truly understood what humans had endured to reach the stars. She was still reading when the Academy's day cycle ended and the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate evening. The sounds of student activity in the corridors gradually faded as beings settled into their rest periods. Sarah realized she was exhausted, both from the long journey and from the stress of trying to navigate her first day in an entirely alien environment. As she prepared for sleep, she caught sight of herself in the room's mirror and was struck by how ordinary she looked. She was 26 years old, of average height and build, with dark hair and eyes that reflected her mixed Chinese and European ancestry. By human standards, she was unremarkable in every way except for her intelligence and education. But here, in this place, she was a unique specimen, the first representative of a species that the galaxy was still trying to understand. She wondered if she was ready for the responsibility of representing all of humanity to these advanced civilizations. She wondered if anyone could be ready for such a task. Outside her window, the Academy's central courtyard had taken on an ethereal beauty as bioluminescent organisms began their nocturnal display. Students from nocturnal species moved along the walkways, their forms creating flowing patterns of light and shadow. It was beautiful and alien and completely unlike anything she had ever seen on Earth. Tomorrow, she would begin her studies and her real work as humanity's ambassador to the galaxy. Tonight, she would try to sleep and dream of home, of a blue world orbiting a yellow star, where evolution had forged a species tough enough to survive anything the universe could throw at them. She had no way of knowing that her presence at the Academy would soon trigger a series of events that would fundamentally change how the galaxy viewed humanity. She had no way of knowing that within a few short months the other species would discover that they had been catastrophically wrong. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she would meet them the same way her species had always met challenges, with determination, adaptability, and the quiet refusal to give up that had carried humanity from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. The Academy slept, secure in its assumptions about the nature of civilization and the proper order of the galaxy. But Sarah Chen lay awake a little longer, listening to the alien sounds of the night and preparing herself for whatever tomorrow might bring. She was, after all, human, and humans specialized in surviving the unexpected. Sarah's first week at the academy passed in a blur of academic challenges and cultural misunderstandings that left her feeling increasingly isolated, despite her best efforts to integrate with her fellow students. The coursework itself was manageable, though the teaching methods were unlike anything she had experienced on Earth. Instead of lectures and discussions, most classes involved direct neural interfacing with quantum computers that downloaded information directly into the students' minds. The process was efficient but deeply unsettling for Sarah, whose human brain seemed to process the data differently than her classmates. Where other students absorbed complex theoretical frameworks instantaneously, Sarah found herself needing to work through the concepts step by step, building understanding through a process of analysis and synthesis that her professors found both fascinating and frustrating. During a quantum mechanics seminar led by Professor Zixtala, a crystalline being whose thoughts manifested as visible light patterns within their translucent body, Sarah raised her hand to ask for clarification about the mathematical relationship between parallel dimensional states. "I understand the basic principle," she said, "but I'm having trouble seeing how the equation accounts for the observer effect when the observer exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously." The classroom fell silent. Professor Zixtala's internal light patterns shifted to what Sarah's cultural briefings had identified as confusion mixed with condescension. Human student Sarah Chen, the relationship is self-evident once the foundational data has been properly integrated. Perhaps your species' neural architecture is not sufficiently developed to grasp multidimensional mathematics without extensive computational assistance. Several students from various species exchanged glances that Sarah interpreted as amused superiority. A Vorthak student, whose coral-like exoskeleton allowed them to interface directly with the Academy's living architecture, spoke up. "Professor, perhaps we could simplify the concepts for our human colleague. My symbiotic computer indicates that primitive mathematical thinking often requires sequential rather than parallel processing." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'm approaching this differently rather than incorrectly. On Earth, we've learned that complex problems often require breaking them down into component parts before synthesis. Could you show me how the equation handles the transition between dimensional states?" Professor Zixtala's light patterns shifted again, this time displaying what Sarah had learned to recognize as academic interest overriding social dismissal, an intriguing approach. "Very well, we shall examine the equation's structure in detail." What followed was an hour-long exploration of quantum mathematics that left most of the class bored and restless, but revealed something unexpected. As Sarah worked through the problem step by step, asking questions that forced the professor to examine assumptions that had never been questioned, several fundamental flaws in the standard galactic approach to multidimensional physics began to emerge. Her human method of breaking complex problems into manageable pieces exposed logical gaps that the other species' parallel processing had simply glossed over. "Fascinating," Professor Zixtala admitted as the class period ended. "Your species' sequential analytical approach reveals structural weaknesses in our mathematical models that we had not previously identified." Most curious, Sarah left the class feeling a mixture of vindication and unease. She had proven that human thinking had value, but she had also clearly established herself as different from her classmates in ways that seemed to make them uncomfortable. The other students avoided direct interaction with her, though she occasionally caught them observing her with what appeared to be scientific curiosity rather than social interest. The pattern repeated itself in her other classes. In molecular biology, Professor Nethara, a plant-like being whose root system connected directly to the Academy's information networks, expressed amazement at Sarah's ability to intuitively grasp evolutionary pressures that had shaped life on death worlds. Most of the Academy's species had evolved under stable conditions, and they found it difficult to understand how biological systems could adapt to constant environmental threats. "Your planet's evolutionary history is quite remarkable," Professor Nethara observed during the session on adaptive genetics. "The speed and efficiency of evolutionary change on Earth far exceeds anything we have observed in normal biospheres. Most of our worlds develop stable ecosystems early in their biological development, allowing for slow, careful refinement over millions of years. Earth appears to have been in a state of constant evolutionary crisis." Sarah nodded. "Our scientists estimate that Earth has experienced at least 5 major extinction events in its history, not counting the ongoing climate changes and geological instability. life on our world has had to develop rapid adaptation strategies just to survive. A Chronic student whose stone-like carapace was etched with intricate cultural markings raised one massive arm. But surely such instability would prevent the development of advanced intelligence? Our homeworld achieved biological stability 12 million years ago, allowing our ancestors to focus on cognitive development rather than mere survival. Maybe, Sarah said carefully, but it also means that when we do develop intelligence, it's incredibly flexible and adaptable. Humans can survive in environments that would kill most other species because we've learned to adapt to changing conditions rather than relying on stable ones. Professor Nithara's photosynthetic patches flickered with interest. Could you elaborate on this concept of adaptation versus stability? Sarah found herself describing humanity's history of migration and settlement, explaining how humans had spread across Earth's diverse environments by developing tools, techniques, and cultural practices that allowed them to thrive in Arctic conditions, high-altitude mountains, and arid deserts. She talked about how human societies had learned to respond to ice ages, volcanic eruptions, floods, droughts, and plagues by developing new technologies and social structures. As she spoke, she became aware that her classmates were listening with an intensity that bordered on fascination and concern. The concept of a species that thrived on instability and change seemed to be profoundly disturbing to beings whose civilizations were built on the assumption that stability and predictability were the foundations of advanced culture. The unease became more apparent during her cultural studies class, where Professor Quillmoth, an ethereal being whose gossamer form seemed to shift between dimensions, led discussions on the principles of galactic civilization. The core concepts were cooperation, harmony, predictable development, and the gradual elimination of conflict through advanced social engineering. The hallmarks of a mature civilization, Professor Quillmoth explained, are internal peace, sustainable resource management, and the ability to resolve disputes through rational discourse rather than primitive aggression. The 46 species of the Educational Consortium have achieved these standards through millions of years of careful cultural evolution. Sarah raised her hand. What about species that achieve rapid advancement through competitive pressure and conflict resolution? Some of humanity's greatest technological and social advances came from periods of intense competition or crisis. The professor's form flickered with what Sarah had learned to recognize as diplomatic disapproval. Conflict-driven advancement is a characteristic of primitive societies that have not yet learned to channel their energies constructively. True civilization emerges when a species transcends the need for competition and aggression. But what if competition and aggression aren't bugs in the system? Sarah asked. What if they're features that serve important functions? Human history shows that controlled competition drives innovation, and that the ability to respond aggressively to threats can be essential for survival. A Sylphid student, taller and more elegant than Veltar, spoke with barely concealed disdain. Such thinking explains why humanity remains confined to a single star system despite possessing faster-than-light travel. Your species' focus on competition and aggression prevents you from achieving the cooperative relationships necessary for true galactic integration. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the casual dismissal of human achievement, but she forced herself to respond calmly. We've been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries and achieved FTL travel 5 years ago. Most of your species took millennia to reach the same level. Maybe our approach is actually more efficient. The classroom fell silent. Several students exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't interpret, but the atmosphere had definitely shifted. Professor Quillmoth's form stabilized into a more solid configuration, which Sarah's briefings had indicated was a sign of stress or concern in ethereal physiology. Human student Sarah Chen, the professor said carefully. Rapid technological advancement without corresponding cultural development is considered a significant danger sign by the Galactic Educational Consortium. Species that develop too quickly often lack the wisdom necessary to use their capabilities responsibly. What kind of danger? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Professor Quillmoth's form flickered again. Historical records indicate that species exhibiting rapid advancement, high adaptability, and retention of aggressive traits have a tendency toward golden to quill. Such species often prove incompatible with established galactic civilization. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happens to incompatible species? The silence that followed her question was deafening. Finally, Professor Quillmoth spoke, in tones so carefully neutral that they conveyed more menace than any threat. The consortium has various methods for ensuring that developing species receive appropriate guidance in their integration process. Education and cultural modification programs have proven quite effective in helping primitive species adapt to civilized standards. After class, Sarah found herself walking alone through the Academy's transport corridors, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just learned. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Educational Consortium didn't just offer education to developing species. They actively worked to modify cultures and societies that didn't meet their standards of acceptability. Her presence at the Academy wasn't just about learning. It was about evaluation. She was being assessed to determine whether humanity could be safely integrated into galactic civilization or whether they required modification to eliminate their dangerous traits. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the conversation taking place in an alcove between two transport tubes. The speakers were keeping their voices low, but her human hearing, evolved for survival in dangerous environments, picked up the whispered exchange between what sounded like a sylphid and a chronac. The human's responses in cultural studies confirmed the preliminary assessments, the sylphid was saying. The species exhibits classic warning signs of aggressive expansion potential, combined with technological acceleration that far exceeds cultural development. Agreed, rumbled the chronac in tones so deep Sarah felt them in her bones. Their homeworld environmental pressure has produced a species optimized for conflict and adaptation rather than cooperation and stability. The Academy's psychological profiles suggest they view aggression as a positive trait rather than a primitive throwback. The Council will need to make a decision soon, the sylphid replied. If the human demonstrates that her species cannot be safely modified, alternative measures may be necessary. Sarah pressed herself against the corridor wall, her heart pounding as the implications sank in. The Academy wasn't just evaluating her academic potential. They were determining humanity's fate based on her behavior and responses. And from what she was hearing, the evaluation was not going well. She remained hidden until the two students moved on, then made her way back to her room as quickly as possible. Once safely behind closed doors, she activated her personal computer and began researching everything she could find about the Galactic Educational Consortium's history with developing species. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Over the past 10,000 years, the consortium had made contact with hundreds of developing species. Most had been successfully integrated into galactic civilization through education and cultural modification programs. But a significant number had simply disappeared from the historical record after their initial evaluation period. The files contained vague references to incompatible species and necessary interventions, but no details about what had actually happened to civilizations that failed to meet the consortium standards. Sarah realized that she wasn't just a student at the Academy. She was humanity's test case, and failure could mean extinction for her entire species. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it also triggered something deep in her human psyche. An evolutionary response that had carried her ancestors through ice ages, plagues, and disasters that would have destroyed less adaptable species. She was, after all, human, and humans had never learned how to give up. The next few days passed with Sarah maintaining her academic routine while carefully observing her classmates and professors with new eyes. She began to notice patterns of behavior that she had previously dismissed as simple cultural differences. The other species' responses to challenges were remarkably uniform. They sought consensus, avoided conflict, and deferred to established authority structures. When presented with problems, they looked for existing solutions rather than developing new approaches. They were, she realized, fundamentally conservative in ways that went far deeper than politics or culture. Their evolutionary histories had taught them that stability was safety and that change was dangerous. They had developed advanced technologies and complex societies, but they had done so by building carefully on established foundations rather than through the kind of innovative leaps that characterized human development. It wasn't that they were less intelligent than humans. In many ways, their mental capabilities far exceeded human norms, but they thought differently, approaching problems with a caution and reverence for established methods that had served them well on their stable homeworlds, but might prove to be a liability in a universe that was fundamentally chaotic and unpredictable. Sarah began to understand why her professors and classmates found her so unsettling. Her human tendency to question assumptions, to break complex problems into manageable pieces, and to look for innovative solutions represented a fundamentally different approach to existence than anything they had encountered. She represented change and unpredictability in a community built on the assumption that such things could be eliminated through proper education and social engineering. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating. She was being evaluated based on standards that were designed to measure conformity rather than capability, cooperation rather than innovation. And by those standards, humanity was indeed dangerous. Not because they were evil or malicious, but because they represented evolutionary strategies that the established galactic civilizations had never learned to understand or control. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. She could try to modify her behavior, to present a more acceptable face of humanity to her evaluators, but doing so would be a betrayal of everything that made humans unique and valuable. Alternatively, she could continue to be herself and hope that her evaluators would eventually recognize the value of human adaptability and innovation. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the alien sounds of the Academy's nocturnal cycle, Sarah made her decision. She would not pretend to be something she wasn't, and she would not allow humanity to be judged by standards that failed to recognize the value of diversity and adaptability. If the galaxy wanted to see what humans were truly capable of, she would show them. She had no way of knowing that her decision would soon trigger events that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization itself. She had no way of knowing that within a few short weeks, the Academy would learn that humans were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Not because of their capacity for violence, but because of their refusal to accept limitations that other species considered absolute. All she knew was that she was human, and humans had never learned to back down from a challenge, no matter how overwhelming it might seem. The incident began during what should have been a routine practical examination in advanced crisis management, a course designed to test students' ability to handle unexpected challenges through cooperative problem-solving. Professor Kethalar, a massive Kronek whose stone-like carapace bore the scars of centuries of academic service, had designed the simulation to evaluate how different species approached emergency situations that required quick thinking and coordinated response. Sarah found herself assigned to a mixed-species team that included Veltar, her sylphid liaison, Goxit, a Vorthak whose coral-like exoskeleton interfaced directly with computer systems, Ixandra, an ethereal whose gossamer form could phase between dimensions, and Threxnel, a young Kronek whose stone skin was still unmarked by age. The simulation placed them aboard a damaged research vessel orbiting a collapsing star, with failing life support, compromised structural integrity, and a limited time window before the star's death would make escape impossible. The scenario was designed to be solvable through careful cooperation and methodical problem-solving. Each species brought specific advantages that, when properly coordinated, would allow the team to repair the ship's critical systems and escape to safety. The Vorthak could interface with damaged computer systems. The Kronek could provide structural repairs. The Ethereal could phase through collapsed sections to access critical areas. And the Sylphid could coordinate the team's efforts through their natural diplomatic abilities. There was no designated role for the human. The solution is evident, Veltar announced after reviewing the scenario parameters. We shall proceed systematically through the repair checklist, with each team member fulfilling their species' optimal function. Goxith will restore computer control, Threxnel will reinforce structural integrity, Nixandra will access block sections, and I shall coordinate our efforts. Sarah studied the scenario data on her tablet, running calculations and looking for alternative approaches. What about the radiation shielding? The star's collapse is accelerating, and the simulation indicates we're going to be exposed to lethal radiation levels before we can complete all the repairs. The shielding systems are secondary, Veltar replied with the patient tone one might use with a slow child. Standard protocol requires life support restoration before addressing environmental hazards. But if we die from radiation poisoning before we finish the repairs, standard protocol doesn't matter, Sarah pointed out. We need to prioritize based on actual threat assessment, not just following a checklist. Gox's coral-like surface rippled with colors that Sarah had learned indicated mild irritation. Human Sarah Chen, the protocols have been developed over millennia of crisis management experience. Individual interpretation is not required. The team began working according to Veltar's plan, with each member focusing on their designated tasks. Sarah found herself relegated to monitoring communications and providing general assistance, essentially staying out of the way while the qualified species handled the important work. She watched as they methodically worked through the repair checklist, but her human-trained mind kept spotting problems they weren't addressing. The radiation levels were climbing faster than the simulation parameters had initially indicated, suggesting an accelerating stellar collapse that would overtake their repair timeline. The structural damage was more extensive than it had appeared, indicating that simply reinforcing the weakened sections wouldn't be sufficient to maintain hull integrity during the stress of FTL jump. Most critically, the power distribution system had been damaged in a way that would make it impossible to simultaneously operate life support, structural reinforcement, and FTL drive systems. We need to reconsider our approach, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm and diplomatic. The power system won't support all our repair efforts simultaneously. We're going to have to make some tough choices about what to fix first and what to sacrifice. Nixandra's gossamer form flickered with what Sarah had learned to recognize as dismissive amusement. The power calculations are within acceptable parameters, human Sarah Chen. Perhaps your species' mathematical capabilities are insufficient to properly analyze the energy requirements. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual dismissal, but this time she didn't suppress it. Instead, she let it fuel her determination to prove her point. Fine. Let me show you the math. She activated the simulation's holographic display and began mapping out power flow calculations, showing how the damaged conduits would create bottlenecks that would prevent the simultaneous operation of all critical systems. Her analysis revealed that the team's systematic approach would result in power failure during the final phase of repairs, leaving them stranded with insufficient energy to escape the collapsing star. Impossible, Beltar said flatly. The Academy's simulations are not designed to be unsolvable. Your calculations must contain errors. Then check them, Sarah challenged. Show me where I'm wrong. What followed was an increasingly heated discussion as Sarah's teammates attempted to find flaws in her analysis, only to discover that her assessment was mathematically sound. The simulation was indeed impossible to solve using their methodical, protocol-based approach. They were faced with a scenario that required improvisation, risk-taking, and creative problem-solving. Exactly the kind of chaotic situation that their stable evolutionary backgrounds had never prepared them to handle. There must be an error in the simulation parameters, Threxnell rumbled, his stone skin shifting to darker hues that indicated stress. Academy simulations do not present unsolvable scenarios. Maybe it's not unsolvable, Sarah said quietly. Maybe it just can't be solved the way you're trying to solve it. She activated the holographic display again and began outlining an alternative approach that made her teammates increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of following the repair checklist sequentially, she proposed a strategy that involved calculated risks and deliberate sacrifices. They would shut down life support in sections of the ship to concentrate power in critical areas. They would deliberately allow some structural damage to continue in order to focus reinforcement efforts on areas that were absolutely essential for FTL jump. Most radically, they would jury-rig temporary solutions that violated safety protocols, but would allow them to escape before the proper repairs could be completed. This plan violates 17 different safety regulations, Beltar protested. The risk of catastrophic failure is unacceptably high. The risk of doing nothing is 100% certain death, Sarah replied. But the protocols exist for a reason, Goxith insisted, his coral surface showing colors that indicated deep distress. They represent the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of experience. And this situation is outside the parameters those protocols were designed for, Sarah said. When you're facing extinction, you can't just follow the rulebook. You have to adapt. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but Professor Kethalar chose that moment to announce a complication to the scenario. Attention students, long-range sensors have detected an additional threat. A quantum storm is approaching the system and will arrive in 30 minutes. You must escape before it reaches your position or face additional hazards. Sarah's teammates looked at each other with expressions that conveyed barely controlled panic. Their methodical approach had already proven insufficient for the original scenario, and now they were facing an additional threat that made quick, decisive action even more critical. We must request clarification from the instructor, Veltar said, his musical voice carrying undertones of strain. The scenario parameters appear to have been incorrectly configured. No, Sarah said firmly. We need to execute the modified plan now. Every minute we spend discussing it is a minute we don't have. She began implementing her strategy without waiting for consensus, using her access codes to override safety protocols and redirect power flow according to her calculations. Her teammates watched in horror as she systematically violated every principle of proper crisis management they had ever learned. Stop. Nixandra's ethereal form solidified with shock and outrage. You're destroying the ship's safety systems. I'm creating a temporary solution that will get us out alive, Sarah replied without pausing in her work. The safety systems won't matter if we're all dead. What happened next would be debated in academy classrooms for years to come. Sarah jury-rigged solutions to problems they hadn't even identified, rerouted power through systems that weren't designed to handle the load, and created a patchwork of temporary fixes that held together through determination and desperate improvisation rather than sound engineering principles. Her teammates found themselves swept along by her frantic pace, their own specialized abilities pressed into service in ways they had never imagined. Goxeth discovered that his Cora-like interface could be used to create entirely new control pathways rather than just accessing existing ones. Thraxno learned that his structural reinforcement abilities could be used to create flexible, adaptive supports rather than rigid barriers. Nixandra found that her dimensional phasing could be used to temporarily bypass damaged systems rather than just accessing blocked areas. With 7 minutes to spare before the quantum storm arrived, Sarah initiated the FTL jump sequence, using systems that were held together by hope, desperation, and engineering solutions that no civilized species would have considered acceptable. The ship's damaged hull groaned under stresses it was never designed to handle. Jury-rigged power systems operated at levels that should have caused catastrophic failures, and safety protocols screamed warnings about imminent system collapse. The ship jumped successfully, emerging from FTL in a safe system with structural integrity at 12%, power systems on the verge of total failure, and life support barely functional. By every measure of proper engineering and crisis management, it should have been impossible. But they were alive. The simulation ended with Professor Kethalar's massive form shifting to colors that Sarah had never seen on a Kronek before. The professor's voice, when it finally came, carried undertones of confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Explain," was all Professor Kethalar said. Sarah looked at her teammates, who were staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to horror to something approaching terror. She realized that she had just done something that challenged every assumption about proper behavior, acceptable risk, and the nature of problem-solving that had shaped galactic civilization for millennia. "I prioritize survival over safety," she said simply. "When you're facing extinction, the only unacceptable risk is the risk of doing nothing." The debriefing session that followed was unlike anything the Academy had ever experienced. Professor Kethalar, joined by 2 other faculty members who had been observing the simulation, subjected Sarah to an intensive analysis of her decision-making process. They seemed particularly disturbed by her willingness to violate safety protocols, her acceptance of high-risk solutions, and her ability to function effective under extreme stress. "Your approach violated 37 different crisis management protocols," Professor Kethalar observed. "The probability calculations indicate that your strategy had a significant chance of catastrophic failure. But it worked," Sarah pointed out, "and the alternative was certain death."
Acceptable risk parameters exist for a reason, another professor interjected.
"They represent the consensus wisdom of advanced civilizations about the proper balance between safety and effectiveness." Sarah felt her human stubbornness rising to meet the challenge. Those parameters were developed by species that evolved on stable worlds with predictable environments. Maybe they're not appropriate for situations that require rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The professors exchanged glances that Sarah was beginning to recognize as deeply troubling. She had just challenged not only their academic authority, but the fundamental assumptions that underlied their entire civilization. Worse, she had demonstrated that her challenge was backed by practical results that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "Human student Sarah Chen," Professor Kethalar said finally, "you will report to the Academy's Psychological Evaluation Center tomorrow morning for comprehensive testing. Your responses to this scenario suggest psychological and behavioral patterns that require immediate assessment." As Sarah left the examination room, she became aware that her teammates were avoiding her entirely. Veltar, who had been politely condescending before, now seemed genuinely afraid to make eye contact. The other students in the corridors gave her a wide berth, and conversation stopped when she approached. Word of what had happened in the crisis management simulation was spreading through the Academy with the speed that gossip achieves in closed communities. But this wasn't ordinary gossip. It was the kind of fearful speculation that emerges when fundamental assumptions about reality are suddenly called into question. Sarah realized that she had crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. She had demonstrated capabilities that challenged the basic principles of galactic civilization, and her evaluators were no longer seeing her as a student to be educated. She was becoming something much more dangerous in their eyes, a representative of a species that couldn't be safely controlled or predicted. As she made her way back to her dormitory, Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations between faculty members and administrative staff. The words she overheard: containment protocols, emergency assessment, potential threat classification, made it clear that her situation had moved far beyond academic evaluation. She was no longer a student at the Academy. She had become a problem that required a solution, and she was beginning to suspect that the Galactic Educational Consortium's solutions for problematic species were not designed with the species' welfare in mind. That night, alone in her room with the Academy's surveillance systems undoubtedly monitoring her every move, Sarah began planning for a future that looked very different from the one she had imagined when she first arrived at the academy. She was still human, which meant she was still capable of adapting to impossible circumstances and refusing to accept defeat even when facing overwhelming odds. The Academy was about to learn that cornering a human was not a safe strategy. They were about to discover that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their intelligence, it was their absolute refusal to give up, even when giving up was the rational response. Especially when giving up was the rational response. The Psychological Evaluation Center occupied an entire section of the Academy's administrative tower, its bioluminescent walls pulsing with patterns designed to induce calm and compliance in the dozens of species that made up the student body. Sarah sat in a waiting area that seemed to adapt to her presence, the walls shifting to colors that human psychology found soothing, while the atmospheric composition adjusted to Earth-normal standards. The attention to detail was remarkable, but it also felt deeply unsettling, like being inside a predator that was trying to make her comfortable before devouring her. Dr. Ythmarin, the Academy's chief psychological evaluator, was a Zephyrian whose crystalline body refracted light into complex patterns that served as both communication and emotional expression. As Sarah entered the evaluation chamber, the doctor's faceted form created prismatic displays that her universal translator rendered as polite professional interest, though she detected underlying currents of what might have been anticipation or concern. "Please be seated, human student Sarah Chen," Dr. Ythmarin said, their voice carrying the harmonic undertones that characterize Zephyrian communication. "This evaluation is routine procedure for all students who display unusual responses to Academy protocols. There is no cause for concern." Sarah settled into a chair that molded itself to her human physiology, while scanning sensors concealed in the walls began collecting data about her biological and psychological state. She could feel the subtle probing of neural scanners designed to read the electromagnetic patterns of conscious thought, though she suspected they were calibrated for species whose minds operated very differently from human brains. "I understand this is about the crisis management simulation," she said carefully. "I want to make it clear that my actions were focused entirely on solving the problem as presented. I wasn't trying to cause trouble or challenge Academy authority." Dr. Ythmarin's crystalline form shifted to patterns that suggested mild amusement. "Challenging authority requires intentional rebellion against established order. Your responses appear to be instinctive rather than calculated, which makes them considerably more troubling from an institutional perspective." The examination that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced on Earth. Instead of simple questions and psychological assessments, Dr. Ythmarin used advanced technology to probe the fundamental structures of human cognition, examining her responses to ethical dilemmas, crisis scenarios, and social situations at a level that seemed to map the basic architecture of her thoughts. "Fascinating," the doctor murmured as data flowed across holographic displays that surrounded Sarah's chair. "Your neural patterns show remarkable activity in regions associated with rapid adaptation and threat assessment. Most species show these patterns only during extreme crisis situations, but they appear to be your baseline state of consciousness." "Humans evolved on a dangerous world," Sarah replied. "Constant vigilance was a survival trait." "Indeed, but the implications are more significant than simple evolutionary adaptation. Your brain chemistry maintains stress response systems at levels that would be considered pathological in most other species. Yet you function normally within these parameters. More troubling, you seem to derive satisfaction from successfully navigating dangerous situations." Dr. Ythmarin's form shifted to patterns that Sarah's translator rendered as clinical fascination mixed with growing alarm. The evaluation continued for hours, probing deeper into the psychological structures that shaped human behavior. The doctor seemed particularly interested in Sarah's responses to authority, her willingness to violate established protocols, and her comfort with high-risk decision-making. "Your species appears to have evolved cognitive patterns that are fundamentally incompatible with civilized social structures," Dr. Ythmarin observed. "You show natural resistance to hierarchical authority, preference for individual problem-solving over collective consensus, and most concerning, you seem to view conflict and challenge as positive experiences rather than problems to be avoided." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying humans can't be civilized?" The doctor's crystalline form flickered with patterns that defied translation. "Civilization, as understood by the Galactic Educational Consortium, is built on principles of cooperation, stability, and the gradual elimination of conflict through rational discourse and social engineering. Your species appears to have evolved traits that actively resist these principles." "Maybe your definition of civilization is too narrow," Sarah suggested. Human societies have achieved remarkable things through controlled competition and the creative tension that comes from diverse approaches to problems. Dr. Yithmarin's response was a cascade of light patterns that somehow conveyed profound disagreement without actually expressing hostility. Diversity of approach is valuable within acceptable parameters. However, approaches that fundamentally threaten social stability cannot be tolerated in an integrated galactic civilization. The evaluation continued deep into the Academy's night cycle, with Dr. Yithmarin subjecting Sarah to increasingly sophisticated psychological probes designed to map the deepest structures of human cognition. What emerged was a picture that clearly disturbed the Zephyrian doctor more with each passing hour. Humans, according to the evaluation, were natural innovators who thrived on challenge and uncertainty. They possessed remarkable individual initiative and problem-solving capabilities, but these traits came at the cost of social compliance and hierarchical stability. They were cooperative when it served their purposes, but they retained the capacity for independent action that made them unpredictable and potentially dangerous to establish social order. Most disturbing from Dr. Yithmarin's perspective was the discovery that these traits weren't aberrations or signs of primitive development. They were core features of human psychology that had been refined and strengthened by millions of years of evolution. Humans weren't going to grow out of their troublesome characteristics through education and cultural modification. They were what they were by design, and changing them would require genetic engineering so extensive that it would essentially create a new species. The evaluation is complete, Dr. Yithmarin announced as the sensors retracted and the monitoring displays dimmed. You may return to your dormitory while we analyze the results. Sarah left the evaluation center with the distinct impression that she had just failed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. The corridors of the academy seemed different now, more hostile and confining. Students and faculty members who had previously shown polite curiosity now avoided her entirely, and she began to notice security personnel following her at discreet distances. Back in her room, she activated her personal computer and found that her access to the Academy's library had been restricted. She could no longer access historical files about the Galactic Educational Consortium's interactions with developing species, and several research databases had been locked with authorization codes she didn't possess. She was being isolated and contained, cut off from information and contact with others while her evaluators decided what to do with her. The realization triggered something primal in her human psychology, the fight-or-flight response that had carried her ancestors through countless deadly encounters with predators, natural disasters, and hostile environments. But she was trapped in the middle of an alien space station with no way to escape and no allies to call upon. Flight wasn't an option, which meant that her evolutionary programming was pushing her toward fight responses that would almost certainly make her situation worse. She forced herself to remain calm and think strategically, using the analytical capabilities that had served her so well in the crisis simulation. He was a single human surrounded by thousands of aliens, trapped in an environment completely controlled by beings who viewed her as a potential threat. Direct confrontation would be suicide, and passive submission would likely result in her species being subjected to the cultural modification programs that the consortium used to eliminate troublesome traits from developing civilizations. She needed allies, and she needed information. Most importantly, she needed to find a way to communicate with Earth to warn them about what they were really facing. Her opportunity came from an unexpected source. As she was reviewing what remained of her accessible files, her room's communication system activated to announce a visitor. She expected to see Dr. Yithmarin or Professor Kethalar, but instead found herself facing Nixandra, the ethereal student who had been part of her crisis management team. The gossamer being's form was more solid than usual, indicating significant emotional stress by ethereal standards. When she spoke, her usually ethereal voice carried undertones of uncertainty and fear. Human Sarah Chen. I require clarification about events in the simulation chamber, Nixandra said without preamble. Your actions produced results that should not have been possible according to established theoretical frameworks. Sarah studied the ethereal carefully, sensing that this conversation might be more significant than it appeared on the surface.
What kind of clarification? Nixandra's form flickered with patterns that suggested internal conflict.
You created solutions to problems that my species' mathematical models indicated were unsolvable. The jury-rigged systems you constructed operated beyond their design parameters in ways that violated fundamental principles of engineering physics. Sometimes you have to push systems beyond their design parameters, Sarah replied, especially when the alternative is death. But the probability calculations indicated cascading system failures that would have resulted in catastrophic destruction, Nixandra insisted. Your approach should not have succeeded. Sarah felt a glimmer of understanding. You've been running simulations, haven't you? Trying to figure out how I solved the crisis scenario. Ixandra's ethereal form solidified further, which Sarah had learned indicated intense focus or stress. My symbiotic computer has been analyzing your solutions continuously since the examination ended. The mathematics are troubling. Troubling how? The ethereal moved closer, her voice dropping to tones that were barely audible, even to Sarah's sensitive human hearing. Your solutions work, but they require assumptions about acceptable risk and system tolerance that no civilized species would consider reasonable. You operated equipment at stress levels that should have caused immediate failure yet somehow maintained functionality through what can only be described as controlled chaos. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what Ixandra was really saying. You think there's something fundamentally different about how humans approach problems, don't you? Ixandra's form flickered with what Sarah had learned to recognize as confirmation mixed with fear. Your species appears to have evolved cognitive patterns that allow you to function effectively in situations that would cause psychological breakdown in other intelligent beings. You not only tolerate uncertainty and chaos, you seem to thrive in such conditions. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Ixandra probing deeper into Sarah's thought processes and problem-solving strategies. What emerged was a picture that clearly fascinated and terrified the ethereal in equal measure. Humans didn't just accept risk. They actively sought it out as a tool for innovation and growth. They didn't just adapt to change, they created change as a means of preventing stagnation. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to view conflict and challenge not as problems to be eliminated, but as opportunities for advancement. This explains the Academy's response to your evaluation results, Ixandra said finally. You represent a form of intelligence that is fundamentally incompatible with the principles that govern galactic civilization. Sarah felt her last hopes for a peaceful resolution begin to crumble. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to humanity? Ixandra's ethereal form began to fade as she prepared to leave. The consortium has protocols for managing species that cannot be safely integrated into galactic civilization. I suggest you use whatever time remains to prepare yourself for implementation of those protocols. After the ethereal departed, Sarah sat alone in her room, contemplating the magnitude of her situation. She was facing not just personal danger, but the potential extinction of her entire species, and she was completely powerless to prevent it through conventional means. But Sarah Chan was human, and humans specialized in finding unconventional solutions to impossible problems. She activated her personal computer and began working on a project that would either save humanity or ensure their destruction. She was going to hack into the Academy's communication systems and send a message to Earth, warning them about the consortium's true nature and their species' probable fate. It was probably suicide, but then again, humans had never been particularly rational about survival odds. They had a tendency to fight even when fighting was hopeless, to struggle even when struggling was futile, and to refuse surrender even when surrender was the only logical option. The Academy was about to learn that cornering a human didn't make them safe, it made them incredibly dangerous. Because humans had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to survive was to ensure that your enemies didn't survive either. And if the Galactic Educational Consortium wanted to eliminate humanity, they were going to discover that humans were perfectly willing to take the entire galactic civilization down with them. Sarah's hack into the Academy's communication systems took 3 days to complete, working in brief intervals between surveillance sweeps while maintaining the appearance of a compliant student undergoing evaluation. Her human brain's pattern recognition capabilities, evolved for survival in chaotic environments, proved surprisingly effective at identifying weaknesses in security systems designed by species that approached problems through methodical, predictable pathways. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was using the same innovative, risk-taking approach that had gotten her into trouble to potentially save her species from extinction. It was exactly the kind of circular logic that would have amused her under different circumstances. She had just finished encoding her warning message to Earth when her room's door dilated to admit an unexpected group of visitors. Dr. Ythmarin led the way, their crystalline form displaying patterns of grim determination, followed by Professor Kethalar and 3 other faculty members Sarah didn't recognize. Behind them came a security detail of Kronek guards whose stone-like carapaces bore the distinctive markings of the Academy's Enforcement Division. Human student Sarah Chen, Dr. Ythmarin announced, you will accompany us to the Academy's containment facility for indefinite detention pending final disposition of your case. Sarah felt her human fight-or-flight response surge, but she forced herself to remain calm. On what charges? Professor Kethalar's massive form shifted to colors that indicated formal authority. You have been classified as a Category 5 security risk based on psychological evaluation results and observed behavior patterns. The safety of the Academy community requires your immediate isolation. Category 5? Sarah repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. What does that mean? The silence that followed her question was more eloquent than any explanation could have been. Category 5, she realized, was reserved for threats so significant that they required permanent containment or elimination. She wasn't just being detained, she was being sentenced to death or something worse. I have the right to appeal this classification, she said, grasping at diplomatic protocols she hoped still applied. Dr. Yithmerin's crystalline form flickered with patterns that suggested bitter amusement. Appeal procedures are available only to students in good standing. Security risks have no recognized rights within Academy jurisdiction. As the security detail moved to escort her from the room, Sarah made her decision. She had always known that her hack into the communication system would likely be discovered, but she had hoped to have more time to prepare. Now, with Academy security moving to contain her permanently, she had no choice but to implement her backup plan immediately. Before you lock me away, she said, I think there's something you should know about the message I just sent to Earth. The security detail paused, and Dr. Yithmerin's form shifted to patterns of sharp attention. Explain. Sarah smiled with the grim satisfaction of someone who had just played their final card. I've been hacking your communication systems for 3 days. About 5 minutes ago, I transmitted a detailed report to Earth's government describing everything I've learned about the consortium's cultural modification programs and the fate of species that fail your evaluation protocols. The reaction was immediate and profound. Professor Kethalar's stone-like skin shifted through a rapid series of colors that Sarah's cultural briefings had never covered, while Dr. Yithmerin's crystalline form blazed with light patterns that overloaded her universal translator entirely. The other faculty members began speaking simultaneously in their native languages, creating a cacophony of alien distress that filled the small room. Impossible, Dr. Yithmerin said finally. Academy security systems cannot be breached by primitive technology. Sarah's smile widened. Your security systems are designed to prevent intrusion by species that think like you do, methodical, predictable, following established protocols. They're not designed to stop someone who approaches the problem from a completely different angle. She activated her personal computer and displayed the log files that documented her infiltration of the Academy's most secure systems. The faculty members watched in growing horror as she demonstrated how she had used their own assumptions about proper behavior to exploit vulnerabilities they hadn't even known existed. You see, the problem with designing security systems around the assumption that everyone thinks alike is that it makes you vulnerable to anyone who doesn't, Sarah explained. I didn't try to break your encryption or overwhelm your firewalls. I just found ways to make your systems think I was supposed to be there. Professor Kethalar rumbled something in the deep subsonic tones that Kronek used for private communication. Dr. Yithmerin responded with light patterns that seemed to convey urgent consultation. Sarah realized that her revelation had triggered some kind of crisis protocol among the Academy administration. The transmission must be intercepted and prevented from reaching Earth, Dr. Yithmerin declared. Emergency containment measures must be implemented immediately. Sarah shook her head. Too late. The message was routed through 17 different relay stations across 4 star systems. Even if you shut down every communication node in the galaxy, copies are already propagating through networks you don't control. She paused for effect, then delivered the information that would change everything. But that's not the worst part. You see, I didn't just send a warning to Earth's government. I sent detailed technical specifications for every piece of advanced technology I could access through the Academy systems. The room fell silent, except for the subtle harmonics of alien respiratory systems struggling to process oxygen in atmospheres suddenly thick with implication. Sarah watched as the full magnitude of what she had done began to dawn on her captors. Faster-than-light communication protocols, quantum computing architectures, biological modification techniques, energy manipulation systems. I sent Earth everything they need to bootstrap their technology by about 1,000 years, she continued. Your message to them was that humanity needs cultural modification to be safely integrated into galactic civilization. My message was how to build the weapons and defenses they'll need to tell you to go to hell. Dr. Yithmerin's form blazed with light patterns that Sarah was pretty sure represented the crystalline equivalent of panic. Such an action constitutes an act of war against the entire galactic educational consortium. Sarah's human stubbornness rose to meet the challenge, fueled by weeks of condescension, isolation, and the growing realization of what the galaxy's civilized species really thought about humanity.
No, it's an act of survival.
You are planning to eliminate or modify my species because we don't fit your definition of acceptable behavior. I just gave them the tools to make sure that doesn't happen. What followed was a frantic conference among the faculty members and security personnel as they tried to determine how to handle a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Sarah listened to fragments of their desperate consultation, picking up enough to understand that her actions had triggered contingency protocols that hadn't been activated in centuries. The Academy was going into full lockdown mode, with emergency communications being sent to the consortium's governing council and military forces being alerted for possible deployment. Her single act of defiance had potentially triggered the first interstellar war in galactic history. But Sarah wasn't finished. As her captors debated containment strategies and damage control measures, she activated one final program she had embedded in the Academy's computer systems. The holographic displays throughout her room suddenly came alive with data streams that documented the consortium's interactions with developing species over the past 10,000 years. "You want to know what humans are really capable of?" she asked as the historical records began displaying on every available surface. "Let me show you what we do when we're cornered." The data streams revealed the truth about dozens of civilizations that had been subjected to the consortium's cultural modification programs. Species that had been deemed too aggressive, too individualistic, or too unpredictable had been systematically altered through genetic engineering, psychological conditioning, and social restructuring until they became pale shadows of their former selves. Those who couldn't be modified had simply disappeared from the historical record, their worlds sterilized and their achievements erased. But scattered throughout the data were references to another category of species, those classified as implementation failures whose modification programs have resulted in unexpected consequences. These were civilizations that had resisted the consortium's efforts so effectively that they had been quarantined rather than eliminated, isolated in remote sectors of the galaxy where their dangerous tendencies couldn't spread to other worlds. The Zarathi, Sarah read from one of the files, classified as implementation failure after modification attempts, resulted in enhanced rather than diminished aggressive capabilities. Current status: quarantined in the Omega sector with automated defense systems preventing contact with other civilizations. She accessed another file, the Cathera, implementation failure due to psychological modifications triggering evolutionary adaptations that made the species more dangerous rather than more compliant. Current status: contained within their home system using quantum isolation barriers. File after file revealed the same pattern. Species that had proven too adaptable, too resilient, or too innovative to be safely modified had been locked away like dangerous specimens in some vast galactic laboratory. The consortium's civilization was built on a foundation of suppression and control. Dr. Yitmarin's crystalline form was now blazing with light patterns that suggested something approaching terror. "Cease this immediately. You are accessing classified historical records that are restricted to council-level authorization." Sarah's smile was all teeth and human predatory satisfaction. "I'm accessing them, and I'm broadcasting them. Every student and faculty member in the Academy is seeing this data right now. Your dirty little secrets about the species you've eliminated or quarantined are spreading through your own information networks." The faculty members and security personnel were now operating in full crisis mode, with urgent communications flowing between the Academy and what Sarah assumed were higher authorities in the consortium hierarchy. She could see the panic spreading through the station as other species began to realize the implications of what they were witnessing. "But here's the really interesting part," Sarah continued, accessing files that made Professor Kethalar's stone skin shift to colors she had never seen before. The implementation failures weren't actually failures at all. They were successes, just not the kind of success you were looking for. The data she was displaying showed that the quarantined species hadn't simply survived their isolation. They had thrived. Cut off from the consortium's influence and forced to rely on their own capabilities, they had developed technologies and social structures that far exceeded anything achieved by the civilized galactic community. The Zarathi developed faster-than-light travel that doesn't require the quantum tunneling networks you depend on, Sarah read. The Cathera learned to manipulate time itself as a defensive mechanism. The Vashti achieved biological immortality through controlled evolution, rather than technological augmentation. She paused to let the implications sink in, then delivered her final revelation. They didn't fail your modification programs because they were primitive or uncooperative. They succeeded in ways you couldn't understand or control. And now you're about to find out what happens when humanity joins their ranks. The emergency klaxons that suddenly began wailing throughout the Academy indicated that Sarah's revelations had triggered alerts at the highest levels of consortium authority. Through her room's transparent wall, She could see security forces mobilizing throughout the station, while faculty and students evacuated to emergency shelters. Dr. Ithmern's form was flickering between patterns so rapidly that Sarah's translator gave up trying to interpret them. "What have you done? What have you done?" Sarah stood up from her chair, her human form seeming suddenly much larger and more dangerous than her slight build should have allowed. "I've shown the galaxy what humans do when you back us into a corner. We don't just fight back. We change the rules of the game entirely." The communication system activated to broadcast an emergency announcement from the Academy's administration. The message, delivered in the formal tones of official crisis management, informed all personnel that the station was now under threat from a Category 1 security emergency, and that evacuation protocols were being implemented immediately. Sarah listened to the announcement with grim satisfaction, then turned back to her captors. "A Category 1 emergency. That's reserved for threats to the existence of galactic civilization itself, isn't it?" Professor Kethalar's massive form had gone completely still, his stone-like carapace displaying colors that suggested a fundamental shift in his understanding of the situation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried undertones of something that might have been respect mixed with terror. "Human Sarah Chen, your actions have potentially doomed both our civilizations to mutual destruction. The consortium cannot permit a species with your capabilities to exist unconstrained, but your technological transfers to Earth have made elimination impossible without triggering a war that could destroy us all." Sarah felt a moment of doubt as the full magnitude of what she had set in motion began to sink in. She had potentially saved humanity from cultural extinction, but she might have triggered an interstellar war that would devastate both civilizations. The weight of billions of lives hung in the balance of decisions she had made in desperation and anger. But then her human nature reasserted itself, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried her species from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. "Maybe it's time for galactic civilization to change," she said. "Maybe the universe is big enough for more than one way of thinking about intelligence, cooperation, and what it means to be civilized." The Academy continued its evacuation as Sarah's revelations spread throughout the galactic communication networks, carried by the same systems the consortium used to maintain their control over member civilizations. The truth about the implementation failures, the cultural modification programs, and humanity's potential was spreading faster than it could be contained. On Earth, human scientists and engineers were analyzing the technological specifications Sarah had transmitted, while political leaders grappled with the implications of her warnings about the consortium's true nature. The galaxy's newest species was about to make a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of every civilization that had ever dared to be different. Sarah Chen stood in her small room aboard the Academy station, watching through her window as the greatest center of learning in the galaxy prepared for an uncertain future. She had come to the Academy as a student, seeking knowledge and hoping to build bridges between humanity and the established civilizations of the galaxy. Instead, she had become the catalyst for a revelation that would reshape the very foundation of interstellar politics. The galaxy was about to learn that humans weren't just another species to be cataloged, modified, and controlled. They were something far more dangerous and far more valuable. A reminder that survival in an unpredictable universe required more than just technological advancement and social stability. It required the willingness to adapt, to take risks, and to refuse surrender even when surrender seemed rational. It required the stubborn human conviction that the universe didn't get to decide what was possible, and that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to be willing to fight for it against impossible odds. The Academy's evacuation continued around her, but Sarah remained in her room, no longer a prisoner but not yet free. She was humanity's first ambassador to galactic civilization, and her real work was just beginning. The galaxy was about to discover that humans didn't just want to join the community of starfaring species. They intended to change it. Whether that change would come through cooperation or conflict remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The age of the Galactic Educational Consortium's unchallenged authority was coming to an end, and humanity was going to play a central role in whatever came next. After all, humans had always specialized in surviving the impossible and thriving in situations that would destroy other species. They had just never had the chance to do it on a galactic scale before. The Academy learned the truth that day, though it would take years for the full implications to become clear. They had cornered a human girl student, thinking they were dealing with a primitive representative of an undeveloped species. Instead, they had awakened something that had been sleeping in the depths of human DNA since the first hominid looked up at the stars and decided that survival wasn't enough. They wanted to reach those distant lights and make them home. The galaxy would never be the same.